My name is Violet Reed. I am the Executive Director of MEVO, the Mawa Environmental Volunteers Organization, and I am also our beekeeper. And behind me you'll see 6 of our hives, and we're at Lovell Farm. That's where we keep our apiary. And today we're going to be talking about fall and winter beekeeping tasks and the things that I do as a beekeeper to prepare bees for the fall, heading in through the colder months, because the goal of any beekeeper is to ensure that their hives will carry through from year to year, because generally the stronger and more mature your hive is, the more healthy your apiary will be as a whole, the more honey your hive may produce. So we're going to go through some of those tasks, and I'm also going to give a bit of a crash course on what goes on in a beehive, what a beehive is composed of, the kind of bees in a beehive. I did a longer video on this and it was meant for little ones, but it would also be a great crash course. So here I'm just going to breeze through just in case you don't know anything about bees, just so we all have a good starting point. So behind me, as I mentioned, we have 6 beehives. They look a little bit different than what you would normally see during, the warmer seasons, because I have them insulated for winter, and we'll talk about that a little later on. But if that insulation was off, you'd see a few different things. So I have a deconstructed beehive, and we'll just talk about it basically from the ground up. So I'll be ducking down once in a while to pick up the pieces. So the kind of beehive that we're keeping in is called a Langstroth hive. So these hives are the easiest to keep in generally. That's what I feel, and that's what most beekeepers keep in right now. They're square boxes, and then they have frames in them, and those frames, in the way that the boxes are constructed, make it very easy for the beekeeper to go in, inspect the hive, pull out frames for harvesting. So right now, most of the industrial beekeeping industry, the hobbyist beekeeping industry, is built on the Langstroth hive, but there are other types of hives. But in a Langstroth hive, you'll always see a few different things. You'll see a bottom board. Here at MEVO, we use a solid and a screen bottom board. Some beekeepers just use one or the other, but here's a solid bottom board. So this is the very first piece of equipment that I'll put down on top of normally cinder blocks when I'm starting to construct my hive. If I'm moving my hives to a new location and I need to reconstruct the hive, if I am starting a new hive, I'm always going to put down a solid bottom board. And then on top of that, I put on a screen bottom board. And the screen bottom board is great for a few different things. One, it allows the bees to help ventilate their hives, so it allows them to draw in air. It allows them to push out hot air if they need to during the summer, if they're going to become overheated. During the winter, and also during the other seasons, but it's particularly important during the winter, if moisture gets into the hive, that's never ideal because bees are really tiny and small bodies, and they can become chilled easily and potentially die. But if water gets into the hive, it's just going to trickle down through the hive, and then it can exit through the screen bottom board, so it's not going to collect in the hive. So it's really great to have that. And again, some beekeepers just use screen bottom boards all the way through winter. And something I should mention is that you could talk to 10 different beekeepers, and they're going to explain a task to you 10 different ways. So every beekeeper has their own style or philosophy, and whatever works for them, and that's great. This is just what I have learned how to do, and I feel works for me. So we have the solid bottom board, we have the screen bottom board, and then once that happens, I'm ready to put on my first Langstroth box, or what I call a deep. So here's a deep, and every one of my hives will have 2 to 3 deeps, and the deeps are what I like to call like the bustling inner city square, town square of a hive. That's where most of the beekeepers are bees are spending most of their time. That's where the queen is normally laying most of her eggs, where they're storing honey and pollen for the winter and for their use during the day or during the week. So that's where a lot of activity and hustle and bustle is going on. And from the deeps, generally, beekeepers will not pull honey from, because oftentimes they know that's the honey the bees need for the winter, or there's a lot of eggs and cappings, so eggs that are capped over in the deeps that they don't want to pull from and then extract from, because then you'd have things you don't want in your honey. So we have the deeps, and then on top of the deeps, so we have anywhere from 2 to 3 deeps. You could have theoretically an infinite amount of supers. So I'm going to show you what a super looks like. And here's a super, so it might be hard to tell the difference from the screen, but a super is a little bit shallower. It's a little less wide as far as it goes this way. Just fell over. In the hive, and the supers are generally meant for bees to store honey in. So they store honey in the deep, they run out of room there, and then they start adding more and more honey into the supers. As a note, bees, or honeybees, excuse me, are one of the only insects that produce honey that produce extra, more than they need. So naturally, and of course through some breeding through time, as we've learned to keep bees better, we have bred them to produce more honey, even more extra than what they already produce. But this extra honey that they're producing goes up into the supers. And some of that honey will be for them, some of that honey is what they need for the winter, and other supers full of honey we can then take to extract, if that makes sense. So in any given hive, if I have 4 supers, I'll leave 1 or 2 full supers for the bees, and then I'll take maybe the top 2 or 3 for us to extract. And a full super full of honey is usually around 60 pounds, so really heavy. Honey is an extremely dense substance. And then within the supers and the deeps, we'll have, of course, our frames. So this frame right here is for a super, so you can tell it's a bit narrower. And this was from a hive that no longer needed its super as it reduced in size during the winter. So I took it off. You may notice that these capped cells right here are actually full of honey. And there's a little bit of exposed honey on this side, so I'll show you. So in the super I took off, this was the only frame with honey on it, and if I had caught it, I would have replaced it with an empty frame in the hive already so that they could have a little more honey. But they have a bit of honey going into winter, so they're okay, and I'm happy I can show you this. But something to note about this frame is that all the wax right here, all this pattern has been built and self-generated by the bees. So sometimes beekeepers, including myself, we'll put in something called foundation on frames, and it's a very thin piece of plastic, or we use wax, and it has the indents of the patterns that we'd like the bees to build in. So we'll have the combs and in a sheet across, and then the bees will use that pattern to build up into their 3D cells. However, bees do know how to build without foundation. Sometimes it just allows the bees to build a little bit more neatly. However, our bees are usually pretty good about it. If we're really careful about how much space we give them to build, they don't go crazy. And it's been amazing to see what they can do without a pattern, just through natural instinct. So we have these frames. There's about 10 in every super, sometimes 9 depending, and then as well 10 in every deep. Some people choose to keep in Langstroth hives that are 8-frame hives, and the benefit of that is if you're beekeeping alone and you're a little bit worried about it being too heavy for you, because the boxes do get super heavy, the deeps and the supers, an 8-frame hive will limit the amount of weight and the amount of honey the bees can pack in. So that could be a really great benefit. Okay, so we talked about the basic construction of a hive, and as with anything in beekeeping, you can go a lot more in depth, even just about hive structure and hive type. But briefly, I want to bring us through the 3 different types of bees that you'll see when you're opening a hive, or if you're learning about what goes on in a honeybee hive. So the first type of bee that you may be familiar with in a hive are worker bees, and here's a photo of a worker bee. You can see she is pollinating something, I believe, but worker bees consist of, I'd say, 97–98% of the hive at least. So if you have a hive of 50,000, most likely 49,000 of them will be worker bees. And the worker bees are the bees that are doing largely most of the functions of the hive. They're foraging, they are collecting pollen and nectar when they're foraging, they're the house bees, they're helping to keep the hive tidy, there are the nurse bees, they're looking after the young bees or the bees that have not yet hatched. Then you also have the guard bees, they're protecting the hive, they're checking who's coming in and out of the hive, they're preventing robber bees from coming in, and then you also have bees who are doing different jobs within those categories. So you have different kinds of house bees, different kinds of nurse bees, and of course there are other roles that they play, but I want to talk about winter and fall beekeeping, so I'm gonna move along. But worker bees are extremely important. They do not lay eggs though, however. They don't have fully developed reproductive organs, though in a time of crisis, they can produce a certain type of bee, but it's not very helpful for the hive. They can produce drones, which are male bees, and that's in a case of an extreme crisis if a queen dies. So that leads me to drones. In every hive, you'll have a few hundred drones, up to 1,000, maybe a little more. If you're seeing more than 1,000 drones, that probably means something's wrong with the hive. The queen has died and the workers have started to lay unfertilized eggs, which are the drones. But the drones are really interesting. They're a bit chubby. They're bigger than the worker bees, and something to mention about the worker bee is a worker bee does have a stinger. Once she stings, she will die. However, drones do not have stingers. They have a rounder body, they have really big eyes, and their job, their most important job, is to mate with the queen. So when a queen first hatches, she'll fly really high up into the air, a few hundred feet, and that's called the drone layer. And in there are a bunch of drones from different apiaries and different beehives flying around, waiting for a queen to come up there. And the queen will mate with up to 6, even more drones, and then she'll have all the sperm she needs to lay the eggs for the rest of her life, which could be up to 5 years. And queens will not mate with drones from their hives. So they're mating with drones from other hives, and so drones are really integral for genetic diversity in bees. Drones are thought to possibly also be like messengers in between hives, so they'll travel in between other hives, they'll communicate with other hives, see what's going on, where the forage is, what diseases are they being hit with, etc. There hasn't been really conclusive evidence to confirm that. However, drones certainly have a really important role in the hive, and sometimes people think, oh, they're not that important because they don't produce honey, but we wouldn't have queens if we didn't have drones, so they're definitely needed. So we have the worker bees, we have the drones. Oh, and something to mention about the drones, which we might talk about a little bit later, is come fall and come cooler weather, the drones will be, food will be withheld from them. The worker bees will not give them food. They're not foraging, so they can't get food by themselves. So they won't be fed, they'll be weakened, and then the worker bees will force them out of the hive. So there are essentially no drones, no male bees in a hive during the winter, and that's because they wouldn't be contributing to anything in the hive. They'd just be eating the precious food storage. So come spring again, there will be more drone eggs laid, and then more drones will be created in order to support the hive during the season as far as mating with the queen and possibly other functions we don't know about yet. So we have the drones, we have the workers, and then I think almost everyone is familiar with the queen bee. So the queen bee is a beautiful insect. She's quite a bit larger than the drones and even the worker bee. You can know she has a really long abdomen, and she looks fairly regal to me. There's only one queen per every hive. There has been some evidence and some findings that some hives have 2 queens, and that's called twin queens, but I have not experienced that yet in our hives. Generally, I only see 1 queen in every hive, and a queen can live up to 5 years. During the peak season in midsummer, she can be laying up to her body weight in eggs every day. She does not go out and forage. Her sole job is to be laying eggs for the hive, and she releases pheromones that the rest of the hive responds to. She really helps the hive be one cohesive unit. So you might have heard of the term hive mind. There are individual bees in a hive, but really they're acting as a collective, as one mind, and the queen really helps to solidify that hive mind, that hive body, through the pheromones she's giving out. So the queen is taken care of by the workers. So there are a group of workers who are constantly feeling her, touching her, feeding her, taking out her waste, cleaning up after her, so she has a posse. However, if the workers feel like the queen isn't laying in a nice laying pattern, she's not laying enough, they just don't like her scent, they just don't like how she's behaving perhaps, they will smother her and kill her, and before they do that, they will start preparing queen cups or special cells within a frame that will produce the next queen. So they will be thinking about succession before they kill their queen. If a hive has a queen, it's called being queen right, and one of the most common problems the beekeeper has is if their hive is not queen right. So maybe I was inspecting my hive and I accidentally crushed a queen and she died. That puts the beehive in a predicament because they have not been preparing for a new queen, and it will take a few weeks for the queen to be ready, up to 16 days, to produce a new queen, and during that time the hive could possibly die out, but it is possible for the hive to be saved. So some beekeepers will buy queens from a queen breeder to put into their hive. Other beekeepers will just see if their hive will requeen. Hives have about a 66% chance of requeening. At Mevo, we've done a bit of both. I haven't had any experiences, thank goodness, with my queen dying and her hive not being able to produce a new one this season, but in the past we have produced queens. Okay, so we talked about the Langstroth hive, we talked about the type of bees in the hive, and now let's talk about why we're really here, what we do in the winter to prepare, in the fall, to prepare our bees. And in order to give you a sense of what we do, I want to give a quick timeline about what happens in a year of beekeeping. So we'll start in January. In January, if I decide I want a few more hives, maybe I lost some hives during the season, or I want to expand my apiary, I'm ready to take on more, I'm going to order what's called a nucleus. So it's basically like a mini hive, about box like this big and this wide, and it will have 4 to 5 frames in it, a bunch of workers, some drones, and a queen. And we buy from someone up in the Finger Lakes who's a natural beekeeper, and then we'll pick them up come May. So I order them in January, I pick them up come May, and then from there I'll transfer them into a deep, and as they build, as they grow, they build up more frames. I will start adding on another deep, more supers. So the springtime is a time of building for our new hives, or for our more mature hives. Normally going into winter, I'll reduce the amount of supers they have in the hive, so I'll start adding on more supers to them. And I'll also be feeding them. In our area, we don't have a lot of forage. There's a lot of development, a lot of neighborhoods that don't allow flowering plants and leaves and shrubs. And so there's not a lot of food for the bees in the spring. Specifically, bees are looking for dandelions in the spring, one of the first flowers to come up. Any flowering bulb like tulips, hyacinths, alliums, those are great for bees come spring. There's not a lot around here. So springtime, I'm building up the hive, adding on more supers or deeps, and I'm also feeding with a sugar water syrup. It's not the ideal situation for the bees, but if they didn't have it, they die, because at that point during the winter they've eaten up most of their honey, so they do need food to start them off for the season. Then after the springtime, as we head into summer, this is peak nectar flow for the bees. There's a lot of things flowering, a lot of things growing, a lot of food for them, so they are busy collecting pollen, collecting nectar, turning that nectar into honey. And so I have to be on my hives. I have to be really monitoring and inspecting them. And so I'm constantly putting new supers on as they build and build and build. And something to note is that each hive is quite different. They do have a bit of a personality. They have a different work flow, different vitality, different kind of energy. And so with our hives, one hive may have 7 supers and another hive may have 3, and they may be about the same age. It's just about the strength of the foragers or what the bees want. Maybe they're just going to forage until they have enough. So that happens in the summer, and then that brings me to the rest of the season. So we talked about spring, we talked about summer, and that was a very brief general overview. There are other things that happen in the hive that I do during that time, but as we approach the end of summer, we at Mevo will harvest our honey. This year we did it a little later. We did it in September. I wanted to see if I could give the bees a bit more time to collect more honey, just because there wasn't a great nectar flow around us this season. So towards the end of summer or early fall, we'll collect our honey. And as we head into the end of August, we're going into what's called a dearth period. So the summer nectar flow is over. So the summer flowers and plants and trees and shrubs, they're not flowering any longer. And then for a few weeks until we hit all the flowering plants in the fall, the goldenrods, the asters, etc., there are a few weeks where there's not really anything flowering, maybe a few plants, but really not enough to satisfy the bees. And so they're in a bit of a frenzy because they still feel like they need to store honey for winter, but they don't have much to forage for, and that's when robbing occurs. So during the dearth period, I have to be very aware and watchful of my hives, because bees from other hives will come in and try to infiltrate my hives and take the honey and bring it back to their hives. And that's a pretty common thing nowadays. If we were in a more open area with a lot more forage, robbing would be less because there would be enough for all the bees. But in the area we live in Mawa, where it's fairly suburban, there's not a ton of flowering plants or shrubs, even during the normal nectar flow. And so generally going into the dearth, the bees don't have the honey store that they'll need for winter. And so they're going to look to other hives to try to get that. And generally the weaker hives will be more susceptible to robbing. So this year at Mevo, we lost 2 hives to robbing, and we know that robbing has occurred because we'll see bees scanning the hive up and down looking for an entrance, and we'll see a bunch of bees basically brawling on the entrance board to the hive. So the guard bees from the hive are biting the bees who are trying to get in to keep them out, and a lot of our hives were successful with doing that. Not all were, and despite some hives, the hives that were successful, they still got robbed a little bit. So during the dearth period, I'm watching the bees for robbing. I'm reducing the entrances, so it's about 1 inch, maybe a few inches larger, so it's easier for the bees, the guard bees, to monitor who's coming in and out. And once robbing occurs, I really view that as the start of my fall season of beekeeping. I know from there on out, for the most part, I'm going to have to feed my bees every few weeks a sugar water syrup like I did in the springtime. I know the hive is starting to think more and more about the winter. They're going to be reducing their population sizes because you don't need a ton of bees going into winter. The queen is going to slow down on laying, and she's going to lay her last eggs for the season, and those bees will be what are known as winter bees, and they're your regular worker bees, but they are just a little bit hardier. They can survive the cold a little bit better, and those bees will live from anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to last through the dead of winter. So in the fall, towards the end of August, we have our dearth period. I start feeding the bees sugar water. The queen starts laying her last few eggs as we get deeper into fall, and those will be the bees that will be in the hive during the winter time. And then as we get deeper and deeper into fall, as things get colder and colder, the hive's really starting to think about winter, and they're going to kick out the drones. The drones get kicked out of the hive because, like we mentioned before, they're not really contributing much to the hive, and with the resources so precious during the winter time, the hive cannot afford to feed them through the winter, so they get kicked out in the fall. You can physically see the worker bees dragging them out and pushing them out, and they'll die of starvation or hypothermia, unfortunately. But new ones will be laid again in the springtime, and then the cycle starts all over again. So deeper in the fall, the drones are kicked out. I'm still feeding them sugar water. Potentially, depending on temperatures, I could feed them sugar water all the way up through Thanksgiving. This year stopped in early November because I realized that the sugar water, which I put in buckets and put on top of a super, and then I put empty supers on top of it to accommodate for the space, the sugar water buckets, they were collecting the cold and causing a bit of a refrigeration effect in the hive, causing them to be a little bit cooler and working harder to heat their hives. So I stopped feeding them within the hives, and I did what's called open feeding. So I had a bunch of big Home Depot buckets with holes drilled on the bottom, and the bees could come and drink sugar water out of there. And that was also something I used to help mitigate robbing, the thought being that if I put the buckets far enough away from the apiary, the robbers would go and get their sugar fix from the feeders instead of going to my hives, and it did work a little bit. So the drones get kicked out, I'm feeding them sugar water. I'm starting to open feed. Now it's around Thanksgiving. I've stopped feeding entirely, and a few weeks before Thanksgiving I winterize my hives, so I prepare them for winter. And like I said, beekeepers do things different ways. You talk to 10 different beekeepers, they're going to winterize their hive 10 different ways. Some beekeepers do not insulate their hives at all, and their bees do fine. I have not experimented with that yet, and since I felt that our bees were going into the winter weaker, I wanted to insulate them to hopefully give them a bit of a leg up, and to invite them to spend less energy warming their selves than they would need to if I didn't insulate. So on our hives, to winterize them, I do a few different things. I go through all the hives on a warmer day, as warm as can be in the fall, and thankfully we had a really warm fall. I go through the hives, I see what supers or even deeps that they have vacated, what parts of the Langstroth hive they no longer need, and I'll remove those boxes that are not occupied by bees or filled with honey, and then I can use them next year. But the bees don't need them. There's no sense leaving on extra equipment if they don't need them. So I'll take off extra supers and deeps, and then after that I will reduce their entrance a little bit. So I'll use an entrance reducer, which is just a thin piece of wood that you pop into the entrance of the hive. I also use it during robbing season, and I'll reduce the entrance anywhere from like 1 to 3 inches, depending on how strong I think the hive is. If I want to reduce their the ability for cold air to get in even more, I'll do 1 inch. If I feel like the hive is really hardy and can deal with a little bit more open hive, and then I'll give them about 3 inches. So I'll pop that in, and then I'm going to put on my insulation. So the first thing that I do as far as insulating the hive is that we put on 4 of these pieces. So it's just Dow foam insulation, which it may not be the best thing to use. However, it is the most useful as far as keeping the hives warm, and it's durable. So we've used them for the past 3 seasons, the same pieces, and they pretty much look the same. Some beekeepers will use straw. They'll like wrap straw or dry plant material around the hive. There are a bunch of different ways to insulate your hive. It just depends on what works for you and for your storage. So right now we are using the Dow insulation. There could be some effects on the hives that it's causing that we don't know about. I haven't seen any yet, but it has been working for us. So we put on 4 pieces, we ratchet strap it. And then on the top of our hive, and I'm realizing something that I didn't mention when we were talking about the Langstroth hive, I put a piece of 1 inch foam insulation, and this is really good for collecting moisture. Inevitably, moisture is going to occur in the hive when the bees respirate during the winter. This helps to collect it a little bit, or any moisture that may come in from the top of the hive during the winter. And what I didn't mention that I want to talk about is that on the very top of the hive, after you have your last super, you're going to have your inner and outer cover, which I'll show, and this foam insulation will sit on top of the inner cover. So here's our inner cover, a pretty thin but dense piece of wood. And in order to continue to winterize the hive, there's a little notch right here. It's an entrance where the bees can come in and out, so they'll fly in through here and go down to the hive through this hole. I actually will flip this over so that there's 1 less entrance for the bees to come into and 1 less spot for air to come in. And I'll flip this over so that will prevent a little bit less chill from getting into the hive. I will put the thin piece of foam on top, and then I'll put the final piece of the hive, the outer cover, on. So this is a thicker piece of wood, often has some kind of metal or plastic sheeting on the top so water can bead off. I'll put that on the hive, and normally during the summer I have it pushed out a little bit so the bees can access that entryway in the inner cover, but during the winter I'll push it back so that there's no way cold air can get into the hive through the top. And once that occurs, my hive is pretty much winterized. It's ready to go. They don't need much else. Bees in the hive during the winter, even once temperatures drop as low as 50 or below, they will ball up into a nucleus, usually in one of the deeps, and they'll stay that way, kind of like penguins. When the penguins huddle up, and they'll rotate in and out, whether they're in the middle or on the outside, and they'll stay warm that way. Final note on how the bees ball up in a nucleus during the winter is that bees will only heat the space that they need. So they're only going to heat their nucleus. They're not going to heat all the deep to the supers that are currently in their hive. And once if the weather gets a little bit warmer one day, maybe higher 40s, sometimes in the winter it could get up to 50s, they'll go up and they'll get honey if they're hungry and they need food, but those areas of the hive will not be heated. So during the winter, right before winter actually, or in the late fall, once I stop feeding, I weigh the hives, and I do that with a luggage scale. And I'll see how heavy the hives are. If I feel like they're not heavy enough, I'll know that they don't have enough honey and that I most likely will have to feed them during the winter. Most of my hives were not heavy enough. We had a lot of robbing this season. I feel that there was not a ton of forage. Also, I'm a new beekeeper, so a lot of this is trial and error, and I know that I am going to have to feed my bees. Because if I don't, they're going to run out of food and then they'll most likely starve during the winter. So come after the new year, I'm going to make something called fondant or sugar fondant. They're basically just thin sheets of sugar that the bees can nibble on. I don't want to feed them sugar water syrup. It will be too cold for them and they'll get chilled. So I'll be busy in the kitchen come this winter so I can make food for our bees, and that's what we made for them last year, and it carried them through the winter. And in order to accommodate the sugar, what we do is we place the sugar right on top of the frames of the topmost super, and then I put in what's called a spacer. It's just a piece of wood that's a few inches, and then that will account for the extra space that the sugar is taking up. And I feed them a patty about this big every 2 weeks in the winter, and that seems to be enough for them. Now in the wintertime, bees do not, and during the whole year, the whole season, bees will not go to the bathroom in their hives. They're extremely cleanly creatures. You may know that there's really no disease that you can get from bees. There's really nothing, well, excuse me, from honey. You don't really hear about people getting sick from honey or getting any diseases that originate from bees. I would credit some of that to the fact that bees are really clean. They're very aware of the waste and the dirt they're bringing to the hive, and so they won't create any more by going to the bathroom in the hive. So during a warmer day in the winter time, when the sun is shining and it's upper 40s, bees will leave the hive for what's called a cleansing flight. So they'll go to the bathroom, maybe they'll stretch their wings and their legs and fly around a little bit, and they'll do that on most warm days in the winter time in order to keep their hive clean and a place that they'd want to be in. And that, for the most part, is what we do for the bees in the winter time. Once it gets warmer in the spring, usually early April, sometimes March, but March, as we know, comes in like a lion, out like a lamb. I'll take off the insulation, and then the cycle starts again. I start feeding them, I start building the hives back up, and we've head into a new season. If you want to learn more about beekeeping, look out for information on Mevo's Instagram and Facebook account at MEVO, Mevo Earth. That's where you can find information about any workshops we'll be running this spring, this summer, and even into next fall. If you would like to work with the bees a little bit or get more of a one-on-one workshop, you can email us or you can message us on Facebook. All of our contact info is at mevo.org. And if you have any questions about the content I gave in this specific video, you can comment below and I'll monitor the comments and make sure to answer. So I hope you guys learned something new today. I really appreciate you watching, and I hope that you have a great winter and that we'll see you in the spring.